All right, so we just talked a little about the history of evolutionary thought. We talked about a little bit about populations, but mainly we focused on how the changes in evolutionary thought came to be, and a little bit about how adaptations and populations and change were a huge aspect of these new theories that started to describe more accurately how organisms respond in their environment to change, how organisms have variation, and this variation allows them to respond to change their environment. But we didn't really talk much about how some of these first scientists or amateurs and philosophers as well went about explaining the change that they saw. One of the first things I want to talk about is strata, geology, and fossils. This guy on the right-hand side here, Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell was one of Charles Darwin's biggest mentors. Charles Lyell wrote a book called Principles on Geology, and it was this book which spawned a lot of the creative thought that Darwin began to equate to the things that he saw while on the Beagle in South America and the Galapagos Islands. On the right-hand side here, left-hand side, sorry, you see this huge rock formation. This is called the Bear Gulch. This is the Bear Gulch limestone in central Montana. One of the coolest things about the Bear Gulch is that I studied here in 2003 and 2004 with a professor of mine in college, and what we were doing here was we were digging for marine life. Now, why would we be digging for marine life in Montana? Well, about 200 to 500 million years ago, this entire area was in fact an ocean basin. All right, and in this area, you could find many fossils of fish, algae, cephalopods, lots of shelled organisms, mollusks, and all these different things called fossils. Now, fossils basically are the ancient remains of organisms. And what happens is the organisms themselves die or are killed very quickly. And as the organic material begins to break down, it gets replaced with minerals like granite and limestone and other minerals, magnesium, selenium, iron, and these minerals are actually are the remnants of the fossilized organisms that basically were inhabiting this land 200 to 500 million years ago. In this picture right here, you're seeing two organisms, two fish. One of them, this is actually a reproductive organ that is designed for sexual reproduction with the female. These are two of the same species of fish. Now, these fish were actually fossilized. These were killed, covered, and fossilized over millions of years in this position, which is what most believe is an actually mating position of these two fish. That this proboscis, or this structure here, was actually used to deposit sperm into the female. So strata, geology, and fossils are really important. One of the cool things about strata is if you look at this picture, you notice that there are many different lines here. And this is an example of the limestone that we saw in central Montana. Each one of these is a period in time. So if you can imagine, the earliest period of time is on the bottom, and the later, every subsequent hundred, thousands, maybe a couple million years occurs on a strata above it. And above it, more strata. So what geologists can actually find, based on looking on this strata of these geologic features, can look at fossils here, and look at fossils here versus fossils up here, and deduce changes in the environment, number one, and they see fossils that are related to one another but not the same. So what this shows is that organisms may have changed over time in response to the environmental conditions. So the strata and geology and paleontology is the study of fossils in strata. And paleontology was really one of the first clues to the existence of organisms that are not living today, extant organisms or extinct organisms. So Charles Darwin was also an amateur paleontologist as well, and this gives us a view into what life might have looked like a few 100 million years ago, even up to a few thousand years ago. Now, if you look at anthropology, the study of human existence, anthropology is usually studying the top layer of Earth that you would normally see in the ground, too recent to really have created strata like this. So, as we did in Montana, we were working within each different layer and looking for specific types of fossils, looking to deduce evolutionary information from those fossils. So one of the coolest things you can tell from fossils is that all these organisms, look at over here, we have an example here of homologous structures. So homologous structures are structures that differ among organisms, but anatomically, based on their bone structure, they have the same exact structures. So the humerus, radius, ulna, carpius, metacarpals, and phalanges are all common structures within the humans, the cat, the whale, and the bat, except these structures themselves manifest differently depending on how the organism has adapted to their environment. One of the coolest things about this is this shows that there was an evolutionarily common ancestor among all of these organisms. They have the same exact structure, they have the same exact bone features, except the features have changed over a long period of time, millions and millions of years, due to how the organism uses the anatomical structures. For example, the whale's structures are best used as fins. So the structures that are more important in the use of swimming are going to evolve or change differently than organs that are going to be used for running or holding or flying. So the flying structures have the same structures, the fingers, and fingers, but they've been used differently, and because they've been used differently, the alleles that were passed on to each subsequent next generation have adapted or actually been selected for. This is an important term. They've been selected for by the environment. So the bat lives in the air, which is its environment. So any variation that influences the ability to fly for the bat is going to be selected for. So a bat that has wings with greater phalanges versus a bat that has lesser phalanges is not going to have the same ability to fly as the bat with the bigger phalanges. If we look over here for the human, these structures are very specific, they're smaller, and they're used for a specific purpose. And all of this information has been seen by an anatomist, and basically what they do is they look at structures across different organisms and try to make similarities between them, or at least deduce similarities between them. Now if we look over here, analogous structures, we have structures, the human arm, the mouse forelimb, and the bat wing are all homologous structures. Homology meaning same. They're the same structures themselves, except those structures differ in what the organism has used those specific structures for. On the other hand, you have analogous structures. Now, analogous structures are structures that occur on a variety of organisms, but they have no direct evolutionary ancestor, or they have no direct common ancestor. For example, the bird wing is more related to the human arm, but the bird wing and the butterfly wing, even though they're still wings, all right, they have no anatomical similarities. The bird wing, the bat wing, and the butterfly wing have absolutely no anatomical similarities at all. The only thing that has evolved here is the ability to fly. So the ability to fly has actually evolved and changed and adapted in a variety of ways for different organisms and how their phenotype or their anatomy has allowed them to evolve. Now, if we look here, we have derived structures and phylogenetic trees. Now, the first thing we want to look at is understand that these are the three domains of life. You have the eukarya, which all are made up of eukaryotic cells, and we have the archaea and the bacteria. Now, both the archaea and the bacteria themselves are prokaryotes. The archaea and the bacteria have a more common lineage than the eukarya do. One is that they're both prokaryotic cells. If you look at this evolutionary tree, a couple things you notice. Number one, eukaryotes, archaeotes, and the bacteria all have a common ancestor. So that means that all forms of life have a common ancestor. And you can find similarities in these organisms, the eukarya, archaea, and bacteria, in how they respire, in how they use energy, in how their cells are made up, and how they all have a phospholipid bilayer, and how they have some of the same proteins, and even some similarities in their DNA. And what we found here is that the archaea and eukarya actually have more in common than the bacteria in the archaea do. The bacteria diverged. So these divergent factors here are really manifested in something called derived structures or derived characteristics. All right? For example, the archaea themselves are prokaryotic. All right? So something happened here in this branch point. In this branch point, something happened that made all these organisms similar to one another. And most likely, it was eukaryotic cells. Now, if we go back a few chapters, what we know about eukaryotes and eukaryotes is they have organelles. So something happened in this lineage that allowed them to use energy differently. They have chloroplasts, they have mitochondria, they have ribosomes, which all these organisms have as well, but the eukarya have an endoplasmic reticulum, they have a Golgi apparatus, and they have lysosomes. So one thing to keep in mind when we talk about this is all of these organisms and all the organisms that we're going to talk about have a common origin. And this illustration about how the origin of organisms can be manifested is called a phylogenetic tree. All right? So phylogeny is the study of relationships between organisms and their common ancestors. So if you look up here on this tree, every time you see a branch point, this group here, each line, has some sort of derived character or a character that is different from its ancestor. All right? Each one of these derived characters creates the organisms that we even see today. So animals and fungi are actually very closely related from an evolutionary standpoint. And animals and fungi and the plants and the ciliates and slime molds and amoeba are much more closely related than the diplomatids or the flagellates or the trichomonads. All right? And the halophiles and the methanarchaea, both of these are more related to one another than organisms down the line. Yet all these organisms are more related to one another than they are related to any other group in the phylogenetic tree. So we're going to talk a little bit about more phylogenetic trees, but some important things to realize. We have a common ancestor here to all organisms, and each time you have a branch point, you change something called the derived character, a character that changes that makes the next group along the branching different from the original ancestor or this group. So this group was going along, it was some organism, it was changing, it was evolving, something happened in this time period that separated these two groups. Now, if we look at another phylogenetic tree, we're going to talk about three basic principles here called monophyletic, paraphyletic, and polyphyletic. And a monophyletic group is a group that you are referring to that includes all the organisms and they have a common ancestor. If you look at H, I, and J, they all have a common ancestor that is included within the blue here. All right. If you look at a polyphyletic group, looking at E and F, they have a common ancestor. So E and F are monophyletic. But we're talking about, in this example, E, F, and G. Now, E and F, their common ancestor, does not include the direct common ancestor of G. So we call this polyphyletic. So this group here would be called a phylum, and this group would be called a phylum because they have a common ancestor. This group's a phylum because they have a common ancestor. But we're talking about E, F, and G, So the group we're talking about is polyphyletic. Now, paraphyletic is a slightly difficult term. It includes organisms that have a common ancestor, except that we're not including one of the members of the group. So if we were to look at A, B, C, and D all together, it would be a paraphyletic group. No, sorry. If we're looking at A, B, and C together, it would be a monophyletic group, except that we're excluding A. So a paraphyletic group includes organisms with a common ancestor excluding another organism that is in that same phylogeny. All right? So the only reason that we're really showing this is because monophyletic, paraphyletic, and polyphyletic are terms that are used throughout biology when talking about how organisms are related to each other. So your understanding of this principle needs only to go as far as what these terms mean and their relation to what we're referring to. For example, if I'm referring to E and F, you would call that E and F blank. If you're thinking monophyletic, then you're right. If I'm talking about A and B, this group, then you're talking about blank. And if you're thinking of monophyletic, you're also right. If I'm talking about A, B, and H, what are you thinking of? Well, if you're thinking of polyphyletic, you're correct. We're including members of a common ancestor, but we're also including a member from a whole nother group. So that is polyphyletic. Now, if I was including J, I, and H, I would be including something called paraphyletic. I'm not including G, which includes a common ancestor. If we go back a little bit, let's do another paraphyletic example. If I'm including A, B, and D, then that would also be paraphyletic if I wasn't including C. If you have any questions about that, we'll definitely talk about that in class. But let's move along here. So we talked a little bit about populations. So I just gave you a little bit of background about how evolutionary thought came around, why geology has an importance in understanding organisms and their evolutionary history, and that even though that there are organisms that are extinct today, we can still see them in fossils that exist in rock formations, but the organisms themselves didn't actually occur until millions of years ago. So a population, if you're thinking a group of interbreeding organisms in the same geographical area, then you would be correct. Now populations may or may not change regarding to their environmental characteristics. Let's look at adaptation, for example. If you had these deer here and this organism had 2 legs, and let's say the fact that it only had 2 legs made it walk upright, it became smarter as a result, and it was able to run faster with 2 legs. Now, we know this isn't the case, but just for example purposes. If this deer had 2 legs and it gave it some advantage in its environment, whatever it was, then this deer with its 2 legs would compete in its environment better. Let's say if it was faster or smarter or whatever. If an organism competes in its environment better, I mean obtains resources better, has a greater range, obtains more nutrition, lives longer to reproduce more, then this organism is going to pass on its genes at a higher rate or a greater number of individuals than the organisms with 4 legs. If this continued to be a beneficial adaptation, then you would find that the resulting populations in the future are all going to have 2 legs versus 4. Now, how does this come about? Well, variation occurs in all populations. You don't have to go far to look at examples of variation. All humans have massive amounts of variation, and this variation results from blank. If you said crossing over during meiosis and mutations, then you would be correct. Mutations are changes in the genetic sequence. Most mutations are not beneficial, meaning that the body plan that the organisms already have tend to be the beneficial ones, or else the organism wouldn't exist in the first place. So, mutations that result in beneficial characters or beneficial phenotypes can actually be propagated in the population, if they're beneficial, by the organism becoming more fit, by reproducing more and living longer, and then sharing its genes. This is a very important